Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be there, even if just virtually, and very much like to echo and support the points raised by Isabel and her colleagues in their outstanding work on democratizing work and reorganizing the economy. Unfortunately, just as progressive thinkers, such as yourselves, are testing new ideas to democratize work, I'm afraid there are other forces testing new ideas in order to achieve the opposite, which is further concentrate capital. And I would like to share with you the efforts that are currently being conducted in certain circles, including in Europe, in order to achieve so, very much at the back of the very challenges that you described as being, as necessitating further democracy at work, the environmental and the technological challenges that you described. My presentation doesn't have a title, but if it were to have one, it would be Strategic Autonomy, Capital Concentration, and the Needs for Strategic Democracy. I will start by briefly explaining what I mean by strategic autonomy. The term open strategic autonomy is part of Euro jargon, I'm afraid, so bear with me for a second. It's a term that came up about a decade ago in the context of the EU defense policy, but it was quickly forgotten and only dusted off very much in the same period in which Isabel and her colleagues were thinking about their May 1st manifesto, in the early days of the pandemic, when it became apparently that Europe, like many other regions of the world, was suffering from a number of strategic dependencies. Put it briefly, there were shortages of PPEs, hand sanitizers, vaccines, syringes, everything, you name it. The famous stretched and subtle and flexible supply chains that had propelled globalization to new levels in the past 2 decades were faltering very, very quickly in the very first and early weeks of COVID-19. In order to address these strategic dependencies, the European Union came up with a new policy, a new type of industrial policy that it named Open Strategic Autonomy. Part and parcel of this policy was to test 2 alternative propositions in order to reduce these strategic dependencies, initially in health products, but increasingly in other strategically important domains. The first strategy was that of diversifying supply in order to reduce strategic dependencies. I'm using a colloquial expression here, but the idea was to put your eggs in more than one basket in order to make sure that if you couldn't get masks from China, you could have sourced some somewhere else. The other strategy was acting autonomously, including through stockpiling and possibly reorganizing production sites in Europe. As I said, this idea of strategic autonomy as an answer to strategic dependencies increasingly grew on the European Union and expanded to other areas of strategic importance, in particular, those technological areas that are linked to the green transition and those that are linked to the digital transition. The EU aspires to avail itself on a number of tools in order to support its strategic autonomy campaign that increasingly is looking a bit more like America First, the Chinese initiative of Silk and Belt Road, and so on and so forth. Some of them are linked, in fact, to the use of defensive trade policies, including through more aggressive forms of anti-dumping regulation. Another tool would be that of strengthening state aid by reducing state aid measures and state aid control measures in European Union law. The same could apply, and in fact has applied in the early days of since the early days of the pandemic, to competition legislation. That's what in North America is referred to as antitrust laws, public procurement legislation, and even direct intervention through EU funds in certain sectors of the economy. This is as far as strategic autonomy is concerned, But let me say something very brief about capital concentration and how the two are linked. In 2019, two very European large companies in the railway sector, Alstom, the French Alstom and Siemens, tried to merge, except their attempt to merge in order to create a super company in the railway sector was blocked by the European competition authorities, by the European Commission. The owners of the two companies claimed, and the legal representatives claimed, that they should have been allowed to merge, even under EU competition rules, because they might have had a dominant position in the European market, but in a global market dominated by global players, including some players such as the China Railway Rolling Stock Corporation that benefit from national subsidies. They couldn't compete unless they achieved a critical size that they could only achieve through a merger and, of course, a dominant position in the European market. The European Commission took none of that and decided to block the merger. And in the very same year, France and Germany, I'm speaking about the French and German governments at the time, jointly drafted a manifesto, Isabel, but a different kind of manifesto, a manifesto for a new industrial policy for the 21st century. In this manifesto, they were making a very strong claim towards liberalizing EU antitrust rules, EU state aid legislation, and EU public procurement legislation in order to facilitate this type of mergers, in order to achieve the creation and the facilitation of new European industrial champions in certain strategic sectors: digital, artificial intelligence, and green technologies, where they wanted to achieve a degree of leadership at a global scale in order to be competitive and facilitate these transitions. You can easily see how these aspirations of the Franco-German manifesto easily feed into some visions and some versions of the open strategic autonomy debate that is currently developing at the European level. But you can also see how, if open strategic autonomy were to lead to a scenario of greater capital concentration in strategically important sectors that deal with extremely pervasive and vitally important technologies, from the green technologies to the digital technologies, artificial intelligence and the cloud, we could soon be dealing with some, in a certain way, European state-sponsored, but very private and very powerful corporations that, unlike their counterparts, the other industrial champions that the EU had produced in the 1970s and 1980s, are under no form of state control. I mean, Renault, Volkswagen in the 1980s were, to a certain extent, supported by the internal market integration in the European Union, but they were still under some form of state control. It's clear that these new champions would be, after decades of privatization and retrenchment of the state, exclusively under the control of their shareholders. Now, this leads me to the third point of my presentation, very briefly, the importance of strategic democracy. And I would like to echo exactly what Isabel and her colleagues have been claiming all along, in the case of Isabel, since 2017. There is a desperate need.
Just wanted to tell you 5 minutes.
Oh, yes. Thank you. There is a desperate need for greater democracy in the corporation. And just as the corporation becomes bigger, more powerful, their influence on labor markets, their influence in terms of power over society, their influence over the economy and democracy as a whole, as such, to justify a greater presence of democratic institutions within the firm, within the corporation, as an important part of democracy in society and the economy at large. There are several attempts at the moment at the European Union to bolster some of the democratic and industrial democratic institutions that have been part and parcel of the European social model, and of particular models, national models of industrial relations, such as the German and the Scandinavian one. You may be aware that we are in the process of renewing and updating the European Works Council Directive. The European Works Council Directive is an old directive that dates back to the 1990s, has been updated once, but is clearly in need of being refreshed, especially when it comes to enforcement. It leads to paradoxical situations where European corporations have European Works Councils that have fewer powers in certain cases than their national counterparts in member states such as Germany and Sweden that have very robust national provisions in terms of internal democracy and democratic decision-making and participation at all levels in the firm. Other examples apply in the current attempts of the European Union to regulate areas such as artificial intelligence, and more so platform work, where the draft directive on platform work in Articles 6 from 7 confers a number of prerogatives in terms of information and consultation for the introduction of such technologies to workers' representatives and hopefully trade unions when the documents will be finalized in the final version. But to wrap up, I would like to both reinforce the fundamental claim for democracy at work and reorganization of the economy that is stated by Isabelle, Dominique, and their colleagues in the latest work, precisely because, unfortunately, the tendency is in the opposite direction, towards greater power and capital concentration within the capitalist firm. Thank you very much.